All right, so this week, kind of plugging along, um, we're going to talk about economics, and we're going to talk mostly about um, capitalism, and we're going to talk a little bit about. Um, for some reason, I can't see my. Hold on one second. Let me figure out why I can't see my. And we'll just talk about sort of the Catholic approach to it. Um, so if we sort of break it down, what we're going to talk about, we'll talk about um, private property, which has to do with distributive justice. We'll talk about the market, which is where we'll talk a little bit about capitalism, which has to do with commutative justice. And then the third part, hopefully, we'll talk about money and usury and a little bit about debt. And then talk about all that the church has said about that. Now, let me figure out how to. Okay. All right. So, being good, Thomas, we're going to define our terms first. All right. So, economics. Here's a definition, and we'll just throw it out there, and then we can refine it as we need to. This is from Lionel Robbins. Is kind of, I think he wrote one of the like encyclopedias in economics. This is the definition he gives. He says economics is a science which studies human behavior as a relationship between given ends and scarce means which have alternative uses. All right. So normally when somebody defines something and it's not St. Thomas, I pick it apart. So let's pick this apart a little bit and sort of see, and I'll help sort of highlight the differences between how Catholics will look at economics versus a more secular view or a more sort of post-Enlightenment view. Or anything in here that you guys sort of see that we need to talk about that sort of strikes you as, well, wait a second, how would that fit with either our understanding of economics or our understanding of our Catholic faith? Like, does anyone object to this definition?
I think I could use like an explanation. It seems like very like philosophical. It's kind of throwing me off.
Okay. Yeah, and so economics is really practical, right? So having a really philosophical definition is a little bit hard. So to me, when I look at this, the first thing that sort of that sticks out for me is two things. So it studies human behavior. All right. So how does economics study human behavior?
I guess a kind of supply and demand, like what we are willing to buy during given certain circumstances.
Okay. So it's an attempt to sort of model human behavior, but does it model it based on sort of rational means, or just something that seems irrational, like supply and demand? So that would be my first question. Would be, okay, how does it actually model it? Does it look at as, man as a free and intellectual being choosing things, or does it look at human behavior just sort of as men are programmed to do? Do they just sort of operate by instinct? So that would be my first sort of question, okay? And so as a Catholic, we look at it and we see human behavior, we immediately say, okay, this has a moral component to it, right? Because we've talked numerous times about human behavior being inherently sort of ethical, right? What about the word scarcity? Does that sort of ring any sort of alarm bells? Like, if you take an economics course, I would imagine a state, they're going to say, well, what's the number one problem of economics? And everyone would say scarcity, how to deal with scarcity. So how does that sit with you to have that as part of the definition?
Well, I think you mentioned before, this is kind of like the everybody getting a piece of the pie thing. Like,
Mm-hmm.
if we view this world as all there is, it's an incomplete picture of reality, and it's going to end up in problems for us. So like, understanding that, you can sacrifice like your piece of pie, and then that actually like multiplies the good in a supernatural way that doesn't really fit into our concept of like space and time in the physical world and stuff like that.
Okay. So would it be fair then to say, I mean, I can sort of let the cat out of the bag a little bit and say that the Catholic understanding of economics wouldn't concern itself so much with scarcity, but would concern itself with sufficiency. So in other words, how much do we have that's enough, rather than the idea of scarcity seems to imply that we're never going to be satisfied, which is partially true. But it makes it seem that we have these unlimited wants and limited resources to fill them, whereas our unlimited want is really this just gaping hole for God, right? And so what we're looking for is a sort of sufficient, amount of goods so that we can grow in virtue and grow in holiness. So let's look at sort of, notice that there's nothing in this about sort of, there's no moral component, right? So there's nothing about justice in this, right? So let's see if we can come up with a better sort of scholastic definition. This is one I pulled out of, I'm not even sure where I pulled this out of, but I did quote somebody. Economics is the social science whose aim is distributive and commutative justice among men concerning their dealings of the bounties of the earth. Economy originally meant the management and regulation of the resources of a household. Okay, so the word oikonomia really means household management. Okay, so there's this question then of how the bounties of the earth are going to be distributed justly, and then how the bounties of the earth, and once they become people's property, how they're going to be traded back and forth. So that's the idea of distributive and commutative justice. So you guys remember the definition of justice?
Isn't it giving to someone that which they are owed?
Yeah, which they are owed, right? Now, in a certain sense, that word owed is kind of, you can sort of flip that a little bit, and you can say that giving back to someone what they owned, right? And so economics sort of is more associated with how we deal with external goods. So how external goods are, how the resources are put into people's hands and how they are exchanged. All right, so is that everyone sort of on the same page about a definition then? We're gonna, go ahead, Connor.
This might be what you're trying to get. It seems like with the scholastics treat economics more as like almost a moral science, where it seems like the economics definition above seems to
It's very secular, essentially.
Yeah. So the problem with modern economics is that they they have this model sort of citizen they call Homo economicus, and what they're trying to do is remove any value judgments upon people's behavior, right? So it's a study of human behavior, and we'll talk more about this when we get to Adam Smith in a little bit. But the idea is that you don't make any sort of judgment on somebody's behavior. It's guided in some way by self-interest, and when somebody acts in their own self-interest, it actually helps other people, is the idea. And so the question of justice never really gets in it. So what I'm trying to sort of make the sort of comparison between is how the church and specific, like St. Thomas would say, well, first of all, because it's human behavior, it's an eminently moral science. So we're really trying to get at, well, how do we come up with a just society in the distribution and exchange of external goods? Okay, does that make sense, Connor?
Yeah.
Okay. All right. So let's talk a little bit about. Hopefully, this part will just be a little bit of a review. So, distributive justice is the order of the whole towards. Here is the order of the whole towards the parts, to which corresponds the order of that which belongs to the community in relation to each single person. So distributive justice is what, remember, so justice is always about relationships, right? Relationships from person to person, that's commutative justice. Then there's a relationship between society and individual persons. What society owes to individuals, we call distributive justice. What the individual owes to society, we call social justice. So social justice, we'll talk more about another time, but we're going to talk about the other two today. And so so commutative justice is always about sort of people are standing there as equals. Distributive justice, you don't look at the equality of the persons in the sense that it's proportional. The sort of classic example is like the parent who has, you know, a piece of cake, and they have a 14-year-old and a 2-year-old. You know, commutative justice would say, okay, split it right down the middle and give them both. Distributive justice would say, well, you know, a 2-year-old doesn't need that much sugar. You know, well, I'd argue maybe a 14-year-old doesn't either. Maybe give it to the 2-year-old anyway. But the point is that you would look at it and go, no, you know, proportionally speaking, the 14-year-old should get twice as much. So you'd give 2/3 of the slice to the 14-year-old, and 1/3 to the 2-year-old. So it's just the idea of that.
Thing, like some places distributive justice makes sense and sometimes the other, or because like with that one example, it would seem like what was the other you said?
Yeah, commutative justice is sort of
like in that example, that seems like that would never make sense. So like, is this a absolute comparison or just a like a?
Yeah. So yeah, my example sort of is, so distributive justice is more like what does what is the 14-year-old owed by the family? And I guess my example sort of falls apart a little bit about, let's just say the 14-year-old and the 2-year-old come upon a slice of cake somewhere, and they have to figure out how to split it. Well, you know, should it be split right down the middle because they both found it, or should you still give more to the 14-year-old? And so commutative justice would say, okay, well, we were equals in this venture of finding it, therefore we should split it down the middle. Does that make sense? You could just shake your head,
So-
Casey. Yes or no? Go ahead, Andrew.
I would say, so are we saying commutative justice doesn't apply within economics, or it doesn't?
It
only
does,
sometimes applies.
Well, it applies in the market, right? So what we're going to do is we're going to look at how private property is handled, and and we'll deal with poverty and all those questions, because it falls under distributive justice. Commutative justice we'll talk about at the end, where we talk about the market, so where people begin to trade things that they already own. So we have to first sort of set it up where we talk about how people even come to own things, which is distributive justice. And then, because the question is, okay, so you have everything throughout the world, right? And God gave all of humanity the gift of the earth. And so the question is, well, how do we distribute the creation among men, right? And so that's why it's sort of prior to anything, right? So that's the idea. Does that make sense, Andrew? Okay.
Yes.
All right. Okay, so let's talk first about what's called the universal destination of goods. Here's what John Paul II said. He said, the primary destination of the resources of the earth to the common good demands that the necessities of life be provided for all human beings before individuals or groups appropriate for themselves the riches of nature or the products of human skill. Okay, so what is he saying here? He's saying that everybody should get a sort of an equal share of the necessities of life. Okay, so the things they absolutely have to have before anyone in the group begins to take to themselves any private property.
Who gets to decide what are necessities and what constitutes the group?
Yeah, so it would be whatever the given society is, and we can look at some examples later when we talk about things like just wages, where it doesn't necessarily have to be the whole world. You can't necessarily work on that level, right? So there has to be some society that's come together around the common good, and then even then you can't necessarily say, well, that's the state's job, because the state's job would only be to take those things that haven't been distributed yet and distribute them. So they'd never redistribute them. So redistribution would have to happen have to happen freely, from a gift from one person to another. And go ahead, Connor.
Just to I guess, make sure I understood something you said. So this isn't when he's saying provided for all human beings, for individuals or groups. He's not necessarily saying on a world wide level. He's talking about okay, this society, or is he talking about like a
Yeah,
worldwide?
no, I don't think he's. I mean, I don't. It's not realistic to. I mean, we can imagine it a little bit because we're sort of so interconnected. But for he's talking about more from like society to society, or even think from like country to country, right? Because a country has a certain amount of natural resources and so forth, right? And so you have a distribution problem if people are living in the Sahara and you've got an abundance of water. Well, how do you get the water to them? So it's more of within a society. So think of like maybe even the size of the think of it from the perspective of like the United States, where we are all gathered around some set of common goods, and everyone has to sort of first share in those. Now certainly there's obligations too throughout the world, but love of neighbor really means like love of neighbor first. So like the people closest to you would be the ones you would that are sort of that you're taking care of, right? It's like, I don't know if your parents ever pulled the like starving people in Africa would be happy to have your food, and as you're a little kid, you're like, oh yeah, like go ahead and put it in a box and mail it to them, right? Like it's just not realistic. And so there has to be a way in which it could be distributed.
And
Go ahead.
just another thing about society. So when I studied a little bit of John Locke for one of my classes, and one of the things that he talks about when civilization is kind of what his explanation for why man leaves the state of nature, I guess at least partially has to do with the idea of like, okay, we're entering into this social contract in which I have my property and I'm able to develop my property. Is that since we're talking about that we kind of the products of human skill, my labor is coming second to this distributive justice. Was the Catholic teaching that the common good existing for a society comes before my individual good, my personal reasons for entering into society?
Yeah. So the universal destination of goods is sort of it's prior to any claims on private property. So even the problem with like Locke's idea is it's too much of an individual, like she has too much individualism in it, right? So I have a certain amount of private property that I already own. It's mine. I enter into society, and I don't have any responsibilities for anyone else. To sort of to each his own, right? Whereas the Catholic understanding would be, no, you really are your brother's keeper, and before you really start developing wealth, you have to make sure that all the people around you have the minimum of needs to survive. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and are we going to talk about how? Because I know Locke has his kind of idea of how private property, as it seems like his justification or how he describes how private property comes about. Are we going to talk about how private property?
Yeah, we can. We're going to talk about private property, and we can, if we can sort of fill in the blanks if we need to when we get to it. Okay, so this part about the universal destination of goods is to just understand that our property, the things of the earth, have a social function that's related to the common good, and that people who are in an extreme need of things always have a prior claim on property. Remember, I think we used this example when we were talking about stealing. Remember, I said, well, if someone was in a grave need, I think we used the example of like the EpiPen, right? If someone is in grave need for an EpiPen, now granted that's something that somebody made and all that, but let's just for the sake of argument, just say it's something that's found in nature. They have a right to that EpiPen, if they were going to die otherwise. Does that make sense? And if you guys remember talking about that. So the point is that that everything starts with that idea that mankind does have dominion over all of the earth, but that means that everyone has to have access to the necessities of life, and that takes on sort of a priority over and anyone's claim to private property.
Does the fact that the EpiPen was made by somebody change that claim?
Sort of, because they actually they own it because they've now put human skill to it. and so he doesn't have he doesn't have necessarily like an absolute right to it. He would have to somehow maybe remunerate the person when he could or something like that. So because it's very clearly that's someone's property, right? So he's not just developing, because it's a product of human skill.
You say you'd have to pay him back, I guess, if and when he could.
Yeah, if and when he could, exactly.
But he would still be allowed to take it.
Yes. Yeah. So you don't have because that's slavery essentially, right? If I have an absolute right towards someone's work, then that's essentially slavery, right? And that's one of the sort of arguments for the cake, like the make the wedding cake for the gay wedding thing, is when someone makes a claim that they have rights to someone else's labor, they're essentially saying that those people are slaves. So labor changes it just a little bit, but you can even imagine, just to make it simple, a glass of water, right? Where, I have water, then the person has a right to the water. Okay, so let's talk a little bit then about poverty, and this will sort of help us. Whoever asked about how do we determine okay, what's this necessary and what's not. So here again, this address that John Paul II gave in 1981 says absolute poverty is a condition in which life is so limited by lack of food, malnutrition, illiteracy, high infant mortality, and low life expectancy as to be beneath any rational definition of human decency. The persistence of such degrading poverty, and especially the lack of the absolute basic minimum of food, is a scandal of the modern world in which one finds enormous contrasts of income and standards of living between rich and poor countries and countries that are materially poor. All right, so he has sort of expanded this a little bit to talk about this sort of interaction between countries and not just individuals. But the point is that when what he wants us to sort of understand is the problem isn't per se economic inequality, or the problem is when when the lower doesn't have the basic necessities of life, which he lists there. Okay, and so a poor person has a prior claim by reason of necessity to the wealth of the world. And when it ends up in the hands of very few, that's when he sort of talks about it being a scandal. And so this is where we have to be careful about secular definitions of poverty versus the church's. We would call what the church is sort of talking about here, we would call that destitution, right? And destitution is what, where someone doesn't have even the sort of minimum of stuff that they need. Whereas the sort of secular definition, poverty, we say, okay, this person making, X number of dollars less than that, they're in poverty. And yes, they're poor, but you can't necessarily say, okay, they're starving, the way you would another way. So the problem is the vast difference between the haves and the sort of have-nothings, and not necessarily the haves versus the have-nots. Although that too, as we'll see when we talk about just wages, will also be a problem. But that's not where we start. Does that make sense? Okay, so that's sort of how the church would sort of then that's why the adjective absolute poverty is important.
Rob, could you talk about destitution? What you mean again?
Yeah, so destitution is just a synonym for absolute poverty. I would say destitution is when someone doesn't have the things they need for sort of a minimum of life, right? They're not eating regularly, they're malnourished, they're illiterate, and or things like that. They may not have clothes, they may not have a house, whatever. Those type of people would be what we would sort of talk about as destitute. Okay. All right. So as long as we're sort of clear now where we're going, so the universal destination of goods says everybody has to have enough to meet their minimum of needs, and only when that sort of is taken care of can we begin to sort of talk about private property. Okay, which is what we're going to talk about now. All right, so Pope Leo the 13th in Rerum Novarum, which was, as we talked about, sort of the opening of the sort of 20th century with where the church sort of really developed its social doctrine. You know, this encyclical was so important that, you know, popes wrote, you know, two other ones sort of marking its anniversary, and one of them was 100 years later, John Paul II in Centesimus Annus. Here's what he said: in Rerum Novarum, Leo XIII strongly affirmed the natural character of the right to private property, using various arguments against the socialism of his time. This right, which is fundamental for the autonomy and development of the person, has always been defended by the church up to our own day. At the same time, the church teaches that the possession of material goods is not an absolute right, and that its limits are inscribed in its very nature as a human right. While the Pope proclaimed that the right to private ownership is affirmed with equal clarity, that the use of goods, while marked by freedom, is subordinated to their original common destination as created goods, as well as the will of Jesus Christ expressed in the gospel. Okay, so let's sort of unpack this first. So why is it, I think we've talked about this a number of times, why does the church defend the right to private property? Why do we need private property?
It helps you be free and independent. So like, I don't know, if all of a sudden, you know, other people won't sell you food unless you become Islamic, or I don't know, like something like that happens, then you have your own food. I don't know.
Yeah, and I mean, especially like in times like these, you begin to realize like how dependent you are on other people. Whereas when you have private property, you know, I have a friend who owns a farm, and you know, he's just going about his business. He bought a new tractor the other day, and he's just going about his business. You know, getting food together, you know, feeding his animals, because he has, you know, he has the ability to sort of take care of himself, and so he's free of a lot of the other stuff that the rest of us are sort of dealing with. And he has with it, not only so does it protect freedom, but it also is an incentive, right, to do well. When you own something, you're going to really take care. Like, this is one of the arguments against socialism, right? When you own something, you're going to take care of it. You're going to work harder at it. When the yield from you know, my friend's farm depends on his work, he's going to work harder, and so he has an incentive, right? Whereas if he was, you know, it was some kind of commune where it didn't, no matter how hard he worked, he'd get the same amount as everybody else, no matter how hard they worked. It becomes an incentive problem, right? And this is, you know, one of the reasons why socialism and communism have failed, is because there's always this motivation problem. Okay,
But would you say that's merely an explanation for why they failed, but that's not necessarily in any way a moral argument, right? Because like, if something's an incentive to, like, if something causes a good result, that's almost,
yeah. So it's a
it's
a consequence, not a reason. Definitely, it's not like, that's not the argument for why it's wrong. It's wrong because it's theft, but it also is plagued by the problem of no matter what you do, you know, the incentive problem always comes up. Okay, so this right, which is fundamental for the autonomy and development of the person, which is essentially what we just said, that for his freedom and for his growth and virtue, has always been defended by the church up to our own day. But again, he says the same thing that we've already been saying. At the same time, the church teaches that the possession of material goods is not an absolute right, and its limits are inscribed in its very nature as a human right. All right, so it's limited by the universal destination of goods. And so if you sort of talk to, you know, how they would label themselves sort of strict capitalists, if you've ever read some of the sort of people who follow like Austrian economics, they would vehemently argue against this. They would say, no, the right to property is absolute. And just, you know, back to Connor's question about John Locke, I think he would say the right to property is also absolute because you bring it into society with you. And so it's yours to begin with, and not something that has any kind of social dimension or social responsibility with it. And so John Paul II then goes on and says, while the Pope proclaimed the right to private ownership, he affirmed with equal clarity that the use of goods, while marked by freedom, is subordinated to their original common destination as created goods, as well as the will of Jesus Christ expressed in the gospel. So the last part is saying that even if we have private property, it's not absolute, because that doesn't mean we can use it however we want. Right? And this is one of the sort of libertarian pitfalls is, well, if you have the sort of absolute right to private property, then how you use it is completely up to you. And then we fall into things like, well, is it okay then to have, strip clubs, or because it's on my private property? What's the difference? But again, the other part is seeing the fact that, and the saints are very clear about this, like the 2 coats in your closet, one of them belongs to the poor. And that's sort of what he's talking about the will of Jesus Christ, that God gave us material goods so that we could share them, and so that we can show charity to our neighbors, so that they can experience the love of God.
Rob?
Yes.
So this, it seems like the 2 reasons we're given for, or the 2 reasons that they argue for private property, it seems like they're very like prudential. It helps people stay autonomous, and it helps people, I guess, practice virtue. And so is that the right way to interpret that it's something that we do it because it does something else, and not so much an absolute thing within it?
Yeah, so when you absolutize something, you make it an end in itself, right? What the church is saying is it's instrumental. So that's the way you would look at it. You would see it, okay, it's an instrument. It's an instrument for me to exercise my freedom, but it's also an instrument for me to grow in virtue. So, go ahead, Casey.
Was it on the topic of private property where we discussed the idea that it allows you to accomplish your duties that are uniquely yours? Like you have a duty to your family that that is more yours than the government's, and so private property allows you to accomplish like the responsibility you have in a way that it wouldn't happen otherwise.
Yeah. So anytime we talk about rights, like I hope this is one of the sort of take homes from this semester. Anytime we talk about rights, we need to always like attach them to a responsibility. Right, so you have the right to private property because you have responsibilities, one of which is to fulfill your vocation, as a husband or a father, or just depending on maybe you're the head of some. So think vocation in like the small sense of the word, right? So so you may own a company, right, which has its own common good and all of that. So yes. And it's just the other part that's sort of important to understand is anything that sort of helps us grow in virtue, we sort of attach it to the natural law, right? So it's natural for us to own private property because it's natural for us to grow in virtue. All right, so let's sort of make sure then, everything we're going to say, like economics from the Catholic perspective is one of those things that you really begin to see the both end part of Catholicism where, you have both this being true and that being true. And so this is one of those things where, okay, well, it seems like what you're saying is there's something wrong with growing richer. And I want to make sure that we're clear about that the church, doesn't think that there's anything wrong with growing richer. It just has to be done within the context of making sure that as you're growing richer, everyone else around you is as well. So here's what Pope Pius XI said in Quadragesimo Anno, which is 40 years after Leo XIII. He says, "Those who are engaged in producing goods, therefore, are not forbidden to increase their fortune in a just and lawful manner. For it is only fair that he who renders service to the community and makes it richer should also, through the increased wealth of the community, be made richer himself according to his position, provided that all these things be sought with due respect for the laws of God and without impairing the rights of others, and that they be employed in accordance with faith and right reason. If these principles are observed by everyone, everywhere and always, not only the production and acquisition of goods, but also the use of wealth, which now is seen to be so contrary to right order, will be brought back soon within the bounds of equity and just distribution." Okay, so he's not saying profit, there's any problem with profit. He's not saying that owners or CEOs shouldn't get a greater share of the profit. But he is saying that, if there's something wrong with the fact that, say a CEO is making millions of dollars while somebody else isn't making enough, isn't making a just wage even to support his family. That before the CEO has an obligation that before he begins to take more and more of the profits, more than he needs, that everyone else's needs are being met. Okay, and that's when we get to the just wage, we'll talk more about that. So it's this aspect of it that's distinctly Christian, a Christian understanding, but nevertheless true, that makes socialism appealing to a lot of people. Because remember last week when we talked about socialism, we talked about all the good things about socialism are really just Christian, and all the bad things are really bad, and that sort of the medicine against sort of the abuses of capitalism. There's this feedback loop going on with sort of capitalism and socialism, right? Capitalism has all these good things about it, but it has all these abuses. And so because of the abuses, people are like, well, then we need socialism. And then, well, socialism is clearly wrong, so the capitalists must be right. And so they go back and sort of harden their position on a lot of those other things. Whereas there's no sort of meeting in the middle. And that's what, and we'll talk about this when we get to capitalism, that's what John Paul II is really trying to get at when we get to that part of it. But just to be clear, none of what I've said and none of what the church is saying would say that socialism is a good thing. And the only problem is, this happens to Pope Francis a lot. He will criticize capitalism and someone will call him a socialist. And to be truly Catholic, there should be criticisms about capitalism. But the solution is not socialism. The solution is to be more Christian. And so redistributing wealth has to happen by the person, and can't be done through robbery from the state. Okay. And so what we need to do is get in a position where we respect that somebody has a just claim on something, that CEO realizes, yeah, you know what, and we're going to talk about an example of a company in which this sort of happened, where he looks at the cashier, and he's like, well, he's barely even able to feed his family, and here I am making millions of dollars. He certainly has a just claim, given how profitable this company is. He has a just claim on some of this, at least enough to feed his family. And so we just have to sort of understand that wealth, any kind of wealth redistribution, has to be done freely. Even if the government can incentivize it, it can't be a question of the government coming in, taking from one person and giving to another. All right, does that part make sense? Because that's the important sort of thing. I don't want this to, the problem always is the either or thinking, where it's both end, where we go from one extreme to the other and think we have to go back to, if capitalism has a problem, then we have to go back to socialism. Okay.
Why was it that the government shouldn't, I think, can you talk about, you said there's like a distribution, a first distribution and then a redistribution or something like that?
Yeah, so let's just take the case of where somebody owns something, where they have private property. Okay. That person has a claim on it, even though the other person has a prior claim on the right to it. The government can't come in and take somebody's work and then give it to somebody else, or the fruit from somebody else's work and give it to somebody else. They have to, now certainly if there were common goods that weren't owned, they could share them with those people. And you see this in some of the sort of, it's not the greatest example, but in Sweden, where they take profits from their oil company. They have this sort of joint oil company that's owned by the state, and they distribute the profits from that sort of equally throughout the society. But they didn't take that. There's other sort of socialistic sort of things going on in the other parts of their economy, but they didn't take that from somebody and give it to somebody else. So they had this sort of pool of common wealth, and then they distributed it to the people who needed it, which is perfectly legitimate. But they didn't take it from somebody and give it to somebody else. but what they can do is they could this is what we do when we, give people tax deductions for giving charitable contributions. That's a incentive to say, hey, why don't you take some of your wealth and share it with people who don't have it. And so that's the extent of what the government can do. They can incentivize it, but they can't then redistribute it because that's stealing. Does that make sense, Kevin?
I think so. I guess maybe
So
is
who
it going
gives?
back to what? Because I think last week it was something like, I think we were talking about this, but I guess it was saying that the task of distributing the goods better was really up to the conscience of like the person with the stuff and not up to the government, kind of thing. Like
Exactly. Yeah.
in the sense
Exactly.
that like they are expected to like to do it, but it's their responsibility, but like the government's not supposed to like override if they're not doing it.
Yeah. So injustice is never solved by more injustice, right? So like I think we talked about this one of the classes. It may have been the semester. The Robin Hood approach. Yes, I remember we talked about Robin Hood because then we argued about whether Robin Hood really did what he did. And Casey's smiling, so I think it was Casey that actually argued it. But let's assume that Robin Hood actually stole from the rich and gave to the poor, and not took from the rich what they had taken from the poor and gave it back. That would be wrong because it's stealing, right? Now, if he really was, giving just restitution. So the problem is that when the idea of the universal destination of goods, when somebody takes more than their share without caring about whether somebody else's necessities have been met, that doesn't mean that they're stealing from that person, right? Because that person didn't necessarily, they have a claim on it, but they didn't necessarily exercise that claim, right? So this is why the always idea of not giving people handouts is always good, because they can go and they can, they grow in virtue and they learn how to feed themselves, because they have access to some sort of material wealth or some sort of good, rather than just having it handed to them. Okay. So, all right. So that's sort of just understanding how the goods should be justly distributed. And we'll kind of come back to it when we talk about the just wage in a little bit. All right. So we said that the second half, the second sort of aspect was commutative justice. St. Thomas defines commutative justice. It says, on the other hand, in commutations are just trading between two people. Something is paid to an individual on account of something of his that has been received, as may be seen chiefly in selling and buying, where the notion of commutation is found primarily. Hence, it is necessary to equalize thing with thing, so that the one person should pay back to the other just so much as he has become richer out of that which belonged to the other. The result of this will be equality according to some sort of arithmetical mean, which is gauged according to equal excess and quantity. All right, so think of, you make a trade like 12 eggs is worth a pound of sausage, and one person gives the 12 eggs to the other who gives them a pound of sausage. And we'll talk more about prices of things in a minute, but the idea, it's usually what we think about when we use justice, so sort of like everybody getting the same thing, but it's just the idea that that a person in some sort of transaction, neither person sort of takes the brunt of the transaction. They equally benefit from it, to an equal amount. And then we'll talk more about the just price. Okay, so and this commutative justice is also what we talked about. That would be the idea of the EpiPen, where when the man could pay, he should pay for the EpiPen, and that's a matter of commutative justice. All right, so let's talk about the free market. What the church means by the free market, and what maybe capitalism means by the free market. Just as the unity of human society cannot be founded on an opposition of classes. Okay, so sort of the when you see opposition of classes, this is usually somebody talking about Marxism, right? So he first in Quadragesimo Anno, he talks about the dangers and why socialism is wrong, and I think we had a couple of quotes from that last week. Now he's talking about, okay, well, the solution to socialism is not unbridled capitalism. So that's where he's going with this. Just as the unity of human society cannot be founded on opposition of classes, so also the right ordering of economic life cannot be left to free competition of forces. So think invisible hand, law of supply and demand, all of those things is what he's talking about. For from this source, as from a poisoned spring, have originated and spread all the errors of individualist economic teaching, destroying through forgetfulness or ignorance the social and moral character of economic life. It held that economic life must be considered and treated as altogether free from and independent of public authority, because in the market, i.e. in the free struggle of competitors, it would have a principle of self-direction which governs it much more perfectly than would the intervention of any created intellect. But free competition, while justified and certainly useful, provided it is kept within certain limits, certainly cannot direct economic life, a truth which the outcome of the application and practice of the tenets of this evil individualistic spirit has more than sufficiently demonstrated. All right, so what is he talking about? Now, most of us would, how many of you guys have even seen this sort of the church's teaching on capitalism before? Some not. So he's criticizing capitalism, right? He's saying, okay, and he's sort of criticizing it at its roots, where he's trying to say that something like the invisible hand or something like the law of supply and demand is irrational. Okay, so it's not guided by human reason, and thus it can't actually be free. Okay, so if it's not known, then it can't be free. How many of you guys sort of know about Adam Smith? Again, some not. Okay, so Adam Smith was a deist. Okay, and one of the things that deists tend to not believe in is original sin. Okay, and there's questions always about human freedom as well. You know, the idea of deism, that God just sort of winds the world up and doesn't really check back in. He just kind of watches, and he has everything sort of lined up so that it happens, ultimately sort of denies human freedom. Okay, because it's, you know, it's God's providence guiding everything, and so they, without any sort of not even a concession towards human freedom, but without even sort of accounting for human freedom. And so this idea then is that by somebody acting in self-interest, they actually help other people. Okay, because self-interest is this sort of natural instinct that we have, this idea of sort of looking out for ourselves. But when we look out for ourselves economically, other people benefit. Okay, which again, sort of everyone that has sort of understands economics, at least that part they understand. They're like, okay, well, it's based on the premise of that, you know, we can act with self-interest, but still, you know, the people, other people will benefit by our own self-interest. What's the problem with that?
Well, it doesn't have a moral component to it. So if we talk about this idea that the economics has a moral sphere to it, and we have to consider distributive and communitative justice, this kind of throws the justice argument out the window and says, well, do what you want, and it will work out best for everybody.
Yeah, and you can think of arguments that people make, right? Like you can think about, you know, for example, like, and we can come back to this example later. There's you know, some kind of tragedy or something happens, and there's a run on, let's say homes get flooded, and so there's a limited number of hotel rooms available. And so the owner of the hotel, because it's scarce, jacks up the price, right? And they say, okay, well, by jacking up the price, everybody benefits because people won't take more than they absolutely need, right? And they say, well, see how the law of supply and demand sort of takes care of that, right? What's the problem with that, though? What's the problem with that approach to it? Just looking at it as this sort of consequence of the law of supply and demand.
I mean, people won't take more than they need, but some people who need it won't be able to get it.
Yeah, the question, really, what he's saying is people won't take more than they can afford, right? Not more than they need. But there's a perfectly rationalistic sort of intervention that can be made, right? Where the owner of the hotel says, no, the hotels cost $49.99, but you can only have one because other people need them, right? And the price didn't go up, right? The price remained the same, and we'll talk about why that sort of thing is important. Why prices should more or less stay the same, with a little bit of fluctuation. But it also, the moral component entered into it. Said, like your family of 7 can squeeze into one of the hotel rooms rather than 2. And so that the people who don't have the money for a $400 hotel room can now still get a hotel room, right? And so that sort of self-interest thing went out the window, because it became, well, no, you need to just take as much as you need. And it's, again, the hotel rooms aren't scarce. Everyone is acting for what's sufficient for them, right, with an eye towards what other people need. Okay, does that make sense? Because that argument, it's really important for us to grasp that argument that actually self-interest, it's just accidental that it appears to work out for everybody else, when what it really works out for is the people who have economic means to buy the thing that's supposedly scarce. Okay. All right. So the problem with Adam Smith, again, not that he is totally wrong, but the fact that he didn't understand the fact that this instinct for self-interest can run amok, right? Because of original sin, because we can actually desire way more than we need, especially as the run on toilet paper exhibits. People will take more than they need because they can, right? Because they're afraid there's not going to be any toilet paper. This thing's going to be scarce, so let me buy a whole lot of it. And then they focused on the scarcity versus making sure they have a sufficient amount of toilet paper. Okay. All right. So that is the sort of the church's criticism of the free market, is that if it's really free, then it can't just be governed by an invisible hand or the law of supply and demand. Okay, because it has to be governed by human reason, if it's going to be just. Okay, and now we can sort of talk a little bit about what that would look like. All right, does my example make sense? Everybody throw me up a thumbs up if it makes sense. All right, cool. All right. So well, I got a clap from Casey, which is always good. All right, so capitalism. All right, so let's talk about it. Okay. John Paul II in Centésimos Annus said, okay, so he's dealing with sort of the failure of communism. And then, okay, so where does that leave us? Does that mean that capitalism wins and capitalism is the best? And he says, well, it depends. Okay. The answer is obviously complex if by capitalism is meant an economic system which recognizes the fundamental and positive role of business, the market, private property, and the resulting responsibility for the means of production, as well as free human creativity in the economic sector. Then the answer is certainly in the affirmative, even though it would perhaps be more appropriate to speak of a business economy, a market economy, or simply free economy. Okay, this is what St. Thomas would call a natural economy. But if by capitalism is meant a system in which freedom in the economic sector is not circumscribed within a strong juridical framework, okay, so there's no connection to the moral law, which places it at the service of human freedom in its totality, and which sees it as a particular aspect of that freedom, the core of which is ethical and religious, and the reply is certainly negative. Okay, so what he's saying is that capitalism is a good when it's governed by the moral law. And so now we'll sort of spend some time talking about what it should look like, okay? And in fact, he even blames capitalism. And again, you could take this criticism and put it sort of in in a vacuum or in a silo and think, oh, well, Pope John Paul II was a socialist. He says vast multitudes are still living in conditions of great material and moral poverty. There's a risk that a radical capitalistic ideology could spread, which refuses even to consider these problems in the a priori belief that any attempt to solve them is doomed to failure, and which blindly entrusts their solution to the free development of the market forces. All right. So we always have to take what the church says in its context. So this follows up on his claim that the sort of laissez-faire capitalism that most, especially in the United States, this sort of liberalism, economic liberalism, always is a bad thing. But as long as we understand that it is the lesser of two evils, though, because certainly socialism is far worse. So anywhere that that freedom is denied, justice can't be achieved. Okay, and so remember, the goal is justice. All right, so let's talk about how commutative justice works in the market. All right, so let's talk a little bit about, so the market is just, we'll make it simple, and we'll just talk about how justice ought to govern exchanges. All right, so St. Thomas, when he looks at this, he puts aside the question of fraud, and he just looks at sort of legitimate interactions in which exchange happens. And so he says we may speak of buying and selling in two ways. First, now whatever is established for the common advantage should not be more of a burden to one party than to another, and consequently all contracts between them should observe equality of thing and thing. Therefore, if either the price exceed the quantity of the thing's worth, or conversely the thing exceed the price, there is no longer the equality of justice, and consequently to sell a thing for more than it's worth, or to buy it for less than it's worth, is in itself unjust and unlawful. So stop for just a second there. Think about that for a second. So what he's saying is when you pay more for something than it's worth, or if you pay less for something than it's worth, both of them are unjust.
I'm kind of confused about that because like things don't have an inherent like dollar worth. Things like what is something worth? It's worth what someone will pay for it. So
okay, so hold your question, Casey, and then we'll come back to it because this there. So St. Thomas would say there is a way to sort of determine
okay.
sort of the inherent worth of things. So yeah, so if we set that part of it aside, and if we let's just assume for right now that there's a way to determine how much something is worth. We have to sort of understand that it goes both ways. Okay, so nobody should pay more than a thing's worth or less than a thing is worth, because there has to be equality between buyer and seller. So if and this all sits down on like who should bear the burden, sort of the economic burden of a trade, right, of an exchange.
So if I can't sell something for more, like normally, like if I were to sell something on eBay, I would choose like, how do I choose who buys it? Whoever's going to offer me more money. But if I can't do that, then do I just pick who I like better?
Yeah. So how would you determine like? Well, again, going back to the question of objective price, you would say the person who is willing to pay the objective price.
So I guess if they're both going to pay the objective price, then it just becomes whoever offered it first, whoever.
Yeah, I mean, you could. Yeah, you could do that. I mean, you would come up with some criteria for deciding when they're tied, right? Okay. All right. So this idea of sort of understanding, like, think of an example. So a guy buys like he's at a garage sale and he buys this trunk of like what seems to be just garbage, right? And then he finds like a Picasso painting in it. All right. Now most people would say, well, that's too bad, right? But what he did was unjust if he doesn't then go back and compensate the people for what he found, right? Because they've now borne more of the economic burden of the exchange than he did. Okay. That's the idea of it. Okay. Is this idea that that everyone, the trade has to be mutually beneficial, and which is sort of
Rob,
what, yes.
so let's say let's do the toilet paper example. Okay, so I
Mhm.
bought, before toilet paper became a scarce item, I bought some, and it was a fair deal when it got bought. And now, I guess this might go back into the price, but now people are willing to pay way more. The price just shot up. Are we saying that the price of that thing or the value of the thing has no fluctuation, or doesn't that admit of
Well,
much fluctuation?
so if it was worth $5 when you bought it, and you didn't do anything, any value added to it. So let's just suppose that that I don't know, you rented a like a storage unit, and it cost you X number of dollars per month, and a month later you have this toilet paper that you're going to sell. It's legitimate to go, well, there's value added to it because I stored it. And you could then say, okay, well, per unit toilet paper it cost me 25 cents to store this, and so whatever value added you did, you could add to the price of it. But if you didn't add any value to it, then you can't charge more for it, right? That's
Sounds like you're saying interest is like evil.
oh, we're gonna get to interest too. Yeah, we're gonna. Well, so you can't you why would you charge interest on a something that you're just sitting on, right? I mean, any cost, like you haven't lost any money since you bought it and then sold it, right? You bought it for X number, and just sitting on it, you have to add value to something in order for it to be more valuable.
Inflation,
Yeah, assume no
dollar
inflation.
system.
Yeah, assume no inflation. Certainly, if you sat on it for 40 years, although I don't know if I'd want to use that toilet paper then. But nevertheless, if you sat on it for 40 years
I'm
and
not a fan of this language of sitting on it. It feels very odd.
okay, well,
Sat on the toilet paper for 40 years, and now here you
yeah,
go.
okay, let's just say you stored it away for 40 years. And the $5 that you spent then now is really, I don't know, is really $7.
So
Then you
if
could
I expect to be able to sell like 3/4 of my toilet paper, can I put the cost of the storage unit so that I would be reimbursed for that cost on the 3/4 I'm going to sell, or like would that be unjust because I'm adding more?
yeah, I would say that would probably be, are you going to get rid of the storage unit after you do that? Like, are you going to move it to your home?
Sure.
Yeah, so maybe you could legitimately say, okay, well, I need to divide out the cost of the storage unit, because the injustice goes the other way. Then you've borne more of the burden of the cost of selling the toilet paper than the person buying it.
Rob,
So yes,
oh, sorry, were you gonna finish this question?
I think, I mean,
I,
that's up
I
to
have
that's
a
up to Casey.
I have one too, so I'm just getting in line.
I
Okay.
have another one, so I can go after Jean-Claude after Connor gets.
Okay.
So let's take the case of collectibles. So you have a car, you have a Babe Ruth trading card, where when it was first printed, it was worth, it was worth whatever it was worth.
Mhm.
And now, because of the fact that it's rarer, or because it's I guess rarity has increased, is it still only worth the what I originally paid for? Or does it not increase?
So a collectible, I mean, certainly scarcity can cause the price to go up a little bit, in the sense of, like, there's no more of these ever to be made, and it's unique in the way it. But
I just want to see someone's face if you like sell them a Babe Ruth signed baseball card for the original like 2 cents it was probably sold for.
yeah, but chances are they didn't buy it for that, right? Anyway.
Oh, so but if they bought it unjustly, then I can then sell it unjustly?
Yeah, I think the collectible that's a hard one, because the value in a collectible is not just a material value, right? The toilet paper was a much easier example. In a collectible, to the owner, so let's use a
Or if we talked about like a historical artifact.
yeah, let's use I think a more cut and dry example, because the collectible is a little harder. Let's just say you find that your pawn shop has your grandmother's ring in it, right? And the pawnbroker sees, oh, this guy really wants this ring because it was his grandmother's. So the buyer has this attachment to it, right? And ignoring how the pawnbroker got it, let's just say the ring is, he paid $50 for it. And he stored it for a month, and he's got to pay for the storage of the thing. He can't then turn around and sell it to the person for $100 just because it was his grandmother's ring, right? So he can't, based on the need of the person, he can't raise the price. By the same token, the person, when he's selling his grandmother's ring, might, because of the sentimental value to it, charge more for selling it because he doesn't really want to sell it. And there's nothing unjust in that respect. And that's where I think
who cares
collectibles would
about
probably
what
come
he
in.
wants to do?
Well, so, but yeah, so the value of a thing is not just its dollar amount, right? That's where the collectible, I think it's complicated, but the value of a thing is not, you try to quantify it with, because money is just, and we'll talk about this, money is just a medium of exchange, right? Where you're taking money and exchanging it for some other goods, right? So the wedding ring is really worth, at $50, let's just say it's worth 50 rolls of toilet paper. Okay. So to that, he can't, the seller in that case can't raise the price because the person really needs it. But if he were selling his own grandmother's ring, he might have it, there might be value added to it because it's his grandmother's ring. And so he can add value to it.
Where are we in the line?
I don't know.
I'm going to ask an easier question, I think.
Okay.
How does this work with sale prices in modern day stores? Because it seems that by definition, one of the two must be unjust.
I would say that you are right. By definition, one of the two must be unjust.
And coupons?
Yeah, and coupons and things like that. I don't know. It's weird.
Yeah. Well, so the point of this, right, is not to sort of nitpick like specific examples, but to show like how the basis of our economic system is broken, right? Because we can come up with things like collectibles that are a little odd, right? That, yeah, you go, okay, well that thing is valuable because it's, because it's rare, because it's because it's something that there's not a lot of, or the baseball, because the market for baseball cards of Babe Ruth, it's a niche market, and within that market the value is I'm already sort of tipping my hand about a just price. Within that particular market, the value of the Babe Ruth baseball card is X number of dollars, and so the just price can come in to that as well.
But I'm confused about it because it seems like you're beginning by saying there's an objective value that this has, but then you're ending by saying, but if there's a specific market where they'll pay for it more, they can pay for it more. But that seems
so this now becomes this becomes the question of who determines what the just price is. Okay, and that's what we're going to get to in a second. And I was sort of tipping my hand when like the collectible was sort of like is a little more difficult situation. But what we're moving towards is how we can come up with an objective price or an objective price for something.
I have one last question.
Okay.
So you talk about like sharing the burden and whatnot. Say I right now try and buy as much toilet paper as I can, and then in 3 months the quadruple ply toilet paper machine's invented, and it makes the cost of toilet paper drop exponentially. I then have all this stuff that that has a high value, like the iPaper. Can I then offload it for an extremely low price now that it's dropped, even though I'm basically bearing the financial burden, or then do I have to demand the price that I got it for?
Well, I mean, realistically, if you demand the price, you're not going to sell it, right? So and again, this is like and we'll get to the difference between like an investment versus interest versus usury. This is, you took a certain economic risk when you bought all that toilet paper, that wasn't going to happen, right? And so it leaves room for loss, right? And it may just be that the objective price for double ply toilet paper went down. It doesn't have to stay the same all the time, right? It doesn't have to stay it's not forever determined that, because it's also affected by things like how many rolls of toilet paper are there actually. and how easy is it to come by and things like that. I mean, that supply and demand has something to do with it, but it can't be something that that totally determines it, is the point. Yes, Sean Farley. Sean, you raised your hand.
Yeah, I raised my hand, but then I had to go to the bathroom, so I lowered it. But I'm back because you just called my name.
Was there
Anyway.
toilet paper in there?
I haven't gone because I was just about to go.
Okay.
The struggles of online meetings.
If you're on your way to the bathroom, I'm glad that your picture's not on the screen. Just we all appreciate that.
Yeah, no problem, Rob. So what I was gonna say was, I feel like all of these questions could possibly be resolved if we just figure out how we're supposed to determine a just price.
Yes,
So,
you guys got ahead of me. I was trying to just sort of set the sort of criteria for understanding that in any transaction, everyone has to benefit equally from it. And that was really all I wanted to sort of I sort of wanted to get at, and then we were going to talk about the just price. Okay, go ahead, Kevin or Nicole.
Rob, yeah.
Yes.
So I think maybe a more general question could address a lot of things. So like one of the things I learned in economics class was like, I guess the strategy to maximize your profit is to price optimize. So you would charge people different prices based on like what they're willing to pay. So like there's lots of different schemes and ways it could happen, but like the general idea was like, if I charge everybody the price they specifically are willing to pay, then I'll make the most money. So I guess we're saying like, that's not how it works. I set one price and right.
Yeah, because what you're doing is you're gauging the price. So what St. Thomas is saying, and we can sort of get into the just price now, is saying that the worst people to decide how much the objective value something is the people that are actually involved in the transaction, which is how it works now. And you can sort of see why that would be, because especially now, it becomes very easy to manipulate prices by manipulating supply and demand, right? So there's ways to manipulate that. Obviously, it's very easy to manipulate supply, but it's also very easy to artificially create demand for things. Like that's why we have, all the money is spent on advertisement, right? Advertisement is a means by which demand is artificially inflated.
Are you culpable at this point? So like the De Beers Diamond Company had the most successful campaign in the world to convince America that you had to buy a diamond engagement ring. So now if you buy a diamond engagement ring, it's not a just price at all. Like at what point? Like I mean, at what point does culpability for it being involved in an economic system go away?
Yeah, so I would say you're culpable if you are the seller in that. So if you were the victim of an injustice, you're not culpable.
I can willingly engage in any injustice.
Well, so it creates like a prisoner's dilemma, right? So I really need toilet paper, and so I have to overpay for it. I wish we had another example besides toilet paper, but and so I overpay for it. I haven't done anything wrong, right? But by the same token, I know that the latest iPhone is overpriced, and so I go out and buy it, even though it's not something that I really need, or even maybe even a rational want at this point. And I'm willing to overpay for it. That changes it, right? That changes the scope of culpability. And you can see sort of why, right? Because it's sort of an irrational buy, right? Does that answer your question, Casey?
Yes, sir.
All right, Kevin or Nicole, whichever one of you guys has your hand up.
Oh, I think I'd raised it for something earlier, but I was just gonna. Yeah, I'm good.
Okay. All right. So did I get everybody? Connor, did I get you?
I think what I was gonna say, which it sounds like we're about to talk about, is this idea of the just price is based in this, I guess, philosophy of realism, where this thing has a value in it, right? Like there's this objective reality in which it's worth something. I think it's more reiterating what Casey said at this point, that I'm also getting a little confused in how we go from this. Okay, this thing has this real value in it, to this idea, okay, where there's some sort of, maybe not subjective to one person, but that there's something beyond just what's in it that seems to be affecting, whether it be the perceived, like the Babe Ruth trading card. For someone who doesn't care about baseball, it's saying you fold your gum in, and for someone who does, it's extremely.
Yeah. So the community, that essentially the baseball card collecting community would sort of set the price for that thing. And there's nothing unjust about that. So it's not the people who are actually buying and selling it. It's just the sort of society from within those types of things are exchanged, right? And so the collectible may not be may not be sort of unjust just because somebody back in 1929 paid 2 cents for it. All right, so let's just talk about the just price, and then we can sort of talk about. And the other thing too, just to understand, is that this is a principle, but then when it's put into practice, it can fluctuate. So we can't just say, this is the idea of it not just having one set price forever. That once you take a principle and you apply it, it has a certain pliability to it. And if you think, maybe this would sort of help us understand, why is price gouging wrong? Like, why do even in our country, why do they say, okay, to charge $37 for hand gel is price gouging?
Because it doesn't, the value of the object doesn't change. It's just the demand for it. And so the people aren't losing money by charging the same price. They're just missing out on an opportunity to get more money because people are willing to pay more for it.
Yeah. So that's the why, but it also supports the fact that, there actually is an objective value to the price, and you've just gone so far beyond it that we now have to sort of ding you and call you out on it, right? If there's no objective value to price, then there's no such thing as price gouging.
So I definitely get the principle that there's an objective value in an object, so you can look at, or rather, so you can look at the material cost in the for the hand sanitizer. You can look at its material cost. You can even take a reasonable wage. You can calculate the labor costs involved. What is the quote unquote objective profit acceptable? So is a 5% profit okay? If it's a bigger risk, can I have a 10% profit? The application feels really odd in terms of an objective profit.
Yeah, I think it would be so that's sort of a different question, right? You certainly wouldn't I mean, you're not supposed to take a loss, so you're not supposed to just cover your costs. Profit is a good thing. Profit helps to determining the cost is essentially how much value you have added to the thing that you made somewhere in the process, right? So, and if you made it from scratch, well, how much value versus the cost have you added that, if someone else were to try to make it themselves, how much value have you added to them trying to do that? And then, yes.
Yes.
Andrew, go ahead.
Okay. I guess kind of going on to that for an example case, the company I work for, we're an electrical contractor, and obviously we have, we do a markup since we're basically a service. So you could say, what do we consider, what is the value we assign to our service for doing this? And I guess you could argue if it's when it comes to products or goods or whatever you call them, if it's targeted food, and that's how much do you mark up? If you were them, how would you mark up and put a value on you bringing it there to them, you organizing it, having a neat store, having quality workers there?
Yeah, and that I mean, you would have a number for you should objectively figure out a number, and then you could also reasonably think, okay, what is a reasonable amount of profit to take on this? And all of that has been determined before you even say, well, how much is this person willing to pay for this thing? Right? You see the difference. And that's the important difference, is that you get to the point of saying how much, not Like, how much is this? How much did this cost me? What's a reasonable amount of profit? There's my price. Before you even gone, well, the person will pay, for the brand new iPhone, for the iPhone, 17, people will pay $1,700, even though it cost us $100 to make, including like distribution and everything like that. Like, that's an unreasonable and a irrational amount of profit, because it's now putting the burden on the person buying it, right?
Would it be then bad to make a profit, to charge more for future success? So like you think about like drug pricing, so you have like one of the, I mean, it kind of goes both ways. You have high drug prices so you can recoup the intense costs in developing drugs, but then it's also so you can develop the next drug. Is that unjust?
Yeah, it doesn't have to be on that product. So it doesn't have to be like, it can be, because companies have that, right? They have things that are really high profit, have really higher profit margins. And then things that maybe they're taking a loss on, or R&D is like a loss, right? In most companies, right? And so to have that covered part of the cost, because it's part of the development of the thing, there's nothing wrong with that, right? The issue always becomes in the fact of when you really get down to how much it costs you, including R&D, like the amount you charge has to be a reasonable amount of profit above that.
So in practice, the simplest thing to do would basically say, try and determine a just price before you ever hear what someone's willing to pay for it, and then just stick to it.
Yeah, because that's the reasonable thing to do, right? Like, you're not allowing, something that's outside of your control determine the price of something. And so normally then there would be, it's easier for companies to do that, right? Because there's normally like a community around them, right? That sort of, going back to and this is the idea of a just price, where, and I'll read this and this will sort of help, right? Who is to ascertain and fix this just value of things in actual transactions? Not those who make the exchange, for they are liable to form prejudiced estimates, and the stronger bargainer will be tempted to use his power at the expense of the weaker. In the opinion of the schoolmen, the valuation could be most reasonably and justly determined by the community. Nor was the community to act arbitrarily in arriving at its common estimate. It was morally bound to take into account certain objective, actual justice. The price, he says, will be just if factors, chiefly the cost of production, the scarcity, and the general utility of the goods appraised. Thus formulated, the social estimate was always the proximate determinant of the just price. All right, and this was obviously so much easier in like medieval times, right, where they would go, well, we know what the yield was this year on corn, so we know that 2 ears of corn are worth 4 eggs or something like that. And so they were able to then, okay, that's a fair trade. And anyone offering that would be too much. So arriving at it is a little more difficult, because the community is now so spread out and all of that. But the point is that if the economic system isn't based on rational decision making as to prices and strictly determined on how much someone is going to pay, then it's going to be inherently unjust. All right. And what that, go ahead, Connor.
So, give me 1 second. Let me move to quiet.
Okay.
So it seems like in a like you gave the medieval example, it seems like in a kind of simpler like farming economy or something like that, very labor based, it would make sense to say, okay, I got some seeds, and then I worked them, I planted them, I watered them, I did all these things for so many months, and I get the harvest, and then so I go to market, and the profit I'm making on that is really just my labor translated into money. Is I put in I only took seeds, I put in all this labor to it, and then I get this money in return as a way of like making my, I guess, labor, actualizing my labor and storing it in this medium.
Mm-hmm.
What I don't understand is how you go when you turn to more like a service economy or something, even like a pawn shop or something like that, where if somebody walks in and they give me whatever, they give me a box, it's for whatever, it's a nice box. I pay them some amount of money for it, and then I store it for a little while. Somebody else walks in, I pay the same amount for it, and maybe a little bit of a charge because I stored it for some amount of time. How are they allowed to make a profit, and where is that profit coming from? Because it doesn't look like they put in much. If there wasn't any, if they're not, it doesn't look like they put in much labor to that.
Yeah, so it's always value added to the thing, right? So, and value added can be additional labor to it, but it could also be moving it, storing it, or anything like that.
But would I be allowed to say, let's say it's, let's just say that the amount I paid, the building I was renting it from and cooling and all these kind of things was $10. Am I only allowed to charge whatever I paid for the box plus $10? Or am I allowed to say, okay, I picked it up? I guess you'd say the fact that I, arranged the store or something like that, or I was, going through my inventory was labor added or value added.
Yeah, I mean, I think it could, in that case, it would be difficult to justify much of a profit on something, right? Because profit always comes in the value added to it, right? And value added doesn't necessarily have to be, just your labor and just your. So let's just suppose you buy this this bag from someone, right? And you're going to turn around and sell it, and you're like, this would be much better if it had a handle on it. And so you add a handle to it. Well, you wouldn't necessarily just add the price of the leather strap and your 4 minutes of labor to sew the leather strap onto the thing. No, you would add the value that now the bag is actually worth more because of like human ingenuity, something you did with it, right? Whereas if I decided, like zippers, they're stupid. They always get jammed and they stink, and I'm just gonna take the zipper off. And I'm just gonna make it easy so people can just load stuff from the bottom or the top. Well, no matter how much labor you put into it, you actually took value away from the bag, right? And so you could only charge less for it. So it's not just like there's not this sort of like the just price now becomes more just because you monkeyed with it and did something to it.
Let's say zippers actually were bad. I'm assuming taking away the zipper at that point would make it worth more.
Yes.
But in practice, it means that, I guess, like I said, the pawn shop example in which I'm, there's not value added. It is not really like you can't make a job out of not adding value to something.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, the storage thing can kind of be a value added to it because you've kept it from deteriorating or you've kept it from the elements of so you've helped maintain its value and it costs you something to maintain its value. But you would have a hard time saying, okay, well, I'm entitled to 5% profit as well. Because the thing really isn't worth 5% more than when you got it. Whereas with the bag example, the thing may really be worth 10% more because it now has a handle. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Okay. All right. So just like I'm kind of anticipating when we get to interest and usury. So I'm going to fly through these next 2 slides so that we can talk more about it. Just like there's a just price for things, there's also a just wage. And so let's talk a little bit about what we mean about a just wage and then how we determine. Okay. So Leo the 13th says merit and reward refer to the same. For reward means something given anyone in return for work or toil as a price for it. Okay, so the sort of this idea of a wage being a price for labor. Hence, as it is an act of justice to give a just price for anything received from another, so also is an act of justice to make a return for work or toil. And then St. Thomas says something similar, as justice demands that a fair price be paid for a material commodity, so it demands that a fair price must be given for human labor. All right, so there's this analogy between if we say there's an objective, if there's an objective price for something, then there must also be an objective price for labor as well. That again isn't necessarily determined by sort of the negotiation between the owner and the worker. All right, where the analogy sort of falls down, and this is what Leo the 13th is talking about, is that you can't apply the law of supply and demand when you're talking about human beings. Okay. All right. So let's sort of summarize what we said, starting with the law, the universal law of distribution of goods. If that's true, then an owner ought to pay his workers what would be considered a family wage, or a just wage, or a living wage. That is, they pay each person that works for them enough to support their family. You guys gonna let me just get away with that?
One
So,
question I have.
Say, repeat that again. I
okay,
was reading the
so
slide.
essentially what it says is that an owner ought to pay his employees enough for them to have all the necessities for their family.
So Rob, how does that take into account when like family sizes change, right? And then like sometimes people decide whether or not they can afford to grow their family or not.
Yeah. So remember, that's a minimum necessity, right? Like you'd have to give him at least enough to support his family. But could you give them more? Yes. And would they make decisions? Would the families make decisions? And let's say they have another child and their cost of living goes up. Well, they ought to also get an increase in their wage for that reason.
Does that also include, like, I mean, this is just such an odd thing for us, like, for me as an American to wrap my head around. Once their kids, like, are no longer their dependent, you'd get a sizable, like, pay cut.
Yeah, I don't think you would ever be able to argue for a pay cut from this, but because the value of your work didn't diminish just because of your need diminished, right?
Well, that's the same though when you're increasing the wage. Your value did not increase or decrease as a worker compared to your need.
Right, but so go back to the universal destination of goods, right? So I'm a CEO, okay, and what is my obligation as a CEO? Well, my first sort of my obligation is to get paid. Like I have a job, I need to get paid. But once I hit necessity, where I have everything needed, my responsibility then becomes to make sure everyone that works for me also has everything they need. Is everyone sort of following me on this? Like that's
Yes, I agree.
okay. Now, that's not normally how it works, right? Like normally, you still have plenty left over. And so the CEO can say, okay, okay, now that I'm good, now that everybody's good, well, actually the person who works at the, I don't know, as a greeter at the door, all their necessities are taken care of, but truthfully, my work is, about 10 times more valuable. So then my salary should be 10 times that. Nothing wrong with that, okay? As long as he keeps doing that across the board, right?
Sure.
And so the point is that wages should be determined based upon how much somebody needs, not just on how valuable their work is. Now, it doesn't necessarily, go ahead.
So you're saying we're determining in the sense of we're setting the baseline based on general what humans need, or for each individual on a case-by-case basis, we're going by what that worker needs?
Yeah, say the first part again because you cut out.
So are you saying that we would determine like the baseline or the minimum wage based on what people need in general, or are we determining case by case each worker's pay?
Yeah,
based on
it would be
individual-
case by case, right? Like you have to know how much a person needs to meet their minimum necessities.
So how would that ever be applied?
Well, I mean, so there's a great example. How many of you guys know about like the CEO of Costco? Like he was a Catholic who did this, did precisely this. Costco pays their employees really well, no matter what they do. Their CEO, the most he ever made, and he ended up being a billionaire. The most he ever made was 12 times his lowest employee. because he thought his sort of value added was 12 times. So I think he, like, his highest salary ever was like $350,000. Now he had profit sharing in there, but he also spread the profit sharing out among his employees. But he did everything in that way, where he looked at, okay, what is the average, person with, how much does it take for the average person to, with 2 children, to meet the minimum necessities every year. And then he finds out, well, that's $37,000 a year. I don't know if that's true. So he's like, okay, that's the minimum salary for anybody that works for me that has 2 children. So, I mean, again, it's not necessarily like they go, and in the Catholic model, there's always the, ideally they're smaller businesses, so people actually know who work for them, know their situations. But nevertheless, it can be done, right? It can be done. And then, they could certainly, there's ways to know, a manager might know, well, you know what, like they have a special needs child. And so they're actually, the dad hardly ever eats because they're paying for the special needs child. Like, well, he needs a raise. So there certainly is a way to make it happen. Did that answer your question, Andrew?
Somewhat. I think so. So a good summary would be start with baseline for everybody needs and adjust as needed from there.
Yeah. Yes, exactly. And this again assumes, this is why profit is a good thing, right? This again assumes that, like, they're not saying, okay, well, you as the owner, you had better pay this guy what he's worth, regardless of whether your company makes any money or not, right? Because then you're doing harm to the common good, right? So it may just be like, okay, well, right now, you know what? I'm getting as close as I can without making us unprofitable. And that's not normally the issue, right? Normally the issue is that, and this is where the income inequality becomes an issue, where, you have somebody working at, a single mother of 2 working at, Walmart making $10 an hour, and the CEO is making, $10 million a year. Like, that's problematic. Because again, if they are, they have to sort of share distributively in the common good, right? So he can't actually sell stuff without cashiers. So she does play an integral role in that person making $10 million a year. But they don't do as much as the CEO, so they shouldn't get paid the same amount. But nevertheless, they should still share in the fruit of the common good. So that's why the church is always like, well, profit is a good thing, because as long as the profit is sort of spread out proportionally. All right, does that part make sense? All right. So let's talk a little bit about. We're going to talk about. Yes. Who asked me a question?
So that was me.
Okay, go ahead, Connor.
A thing I've heard brought up in the, I just kind of when discussing, normally I guess it's probably in context more of like a $15 minimum wage thing, is jobs that are like, let's say, a part-time summer job or something that is I've heard people make the distinction between like a career and something like a job. Does that factor into it, or should any, do you see the kind of where I'm going with this?
Yeah, so the fundamental unit of society is what? Is the family, right? So that's why the church will call it a family wage at times. So a summer job, I mean, that person doesn't have the same obligations, right? Like, you guys don't have the same obligations as somebody who has 4 kids or something. And so it again, like, because they have increased responsibilities, they have a stronger right, or a stronger right claim. So, I mean, I'm always hesitant to, like, I don't think, I mean, I understand the logic of minimum wage laws, but I think they end up being, when you set a low bar like that on somebody, they tend to recoil a little bit, because it's not necessarily free, but they tend to then they lowball everybody then when they do that, rather than take. taking in their needs. Go ahead, Connor.
So I guess in practice, you have the practicing Catholic at Costco who learns Catholic social teaching and then applies it. And you mentioned earlier the idea of, okay, well, we're going to give like a tax break to people who donate to charity, or something like that to incentivize it. How would you? Is there a way to practically incentivize that, short of everybody becoming Catholic and wanting to do it the right way?
So how do you move towards that? Yeah, I think this is always the problem. So how many of you guys have heard of distributism before? So distributism is essentially this idea of trying to get as much private property in the hands of as many people as possible. And the problem always is, well, how do you move from where we are now without like forcibly redistributing property, right? So how do you, and so distributists, while in theory have a good idea, putting it into practice is really difficult. I think grasping this is a little easier because the government can incentivize in different ways. So in other words, I don't know, let's just say for where we are now, a company gets, X number of tax breaks if, if they keep their percentage of employees not on some sort of public assistance below 5% or something, right? So they now go, okay, well, it's actually, this is actually better for us to do it this way. And so when the government puts incentives in place to make it so that people don't need public assistance, and that's the problem with something like Obamacare, right? Is that it creates more situations of public assistance, and it kind of lets employers off the hook a little bit, while at the same time raising the cost for small employers, right? So it's not a sort of an equal incentive issue. So they have to again, the government, because they control the common good, and they can work with things like that to incentivize companies to actually do the right thing. Did that answer your question, Connor?
Yeah, just a follow-up. I'm not sure if we're not sure if we talked about this in the class yet, but are we going to talk about government intervention and when it's listed and when it's not, or is it kind of this idea that are they allowed to guide but not force towards the common good?
Yeah, I mean they can't force. They can force in a certain respect, but the limits always has to be, especially they can't do more harm than good in sort of forcing, right?
So what about that $2 trillion stimulus package?
So, I mean, one of the really interesting points to talk about with this is if the government's saying you're not allowed to operate your business, it makes sense for the government to say we're going to respond. We're going to
essentially compensate you. Yeah.
Yeah, we're going to stop.
Yeah, I mean, I think that this could send us down a rabbit hole, but if the government caused something, then in a certain respect they're on the hook to sort of fix it, right?
Mm-hmm.
If the government crashed a car into your house, it's not a bailout for them to build your house back up.
Yes.
Right. And also, I would also say, like, given the extremity of the situation right now, I wouldn't see it that different from like any other disaster situation, like if a hurricane came through, where the government provides relief. Obviously, this is a different way they're doing it, but
yes, yeah. I mean, I think there's other problems with it, but I think there's at least morally, maybe. I mean, there's probably more prudential ways to do it, but I'm far more concerned about other sort of ways in which they redistribute income than a stimulus sort of package.
Yeah, I think one thing that Nicole brought up earlier, she was talking to me, is kind of like there's almost this like feeling in America that like the government is like God. It's like, okay, here comes this coronavirus, it's like destroying the fabric of our economy because like we just can't operate without the motion that we normally have.
Mm-hmm.
It's gonna wreak havoc. And it's almost like, okay, well, who's gonna fix it? And it's like, at first it's like, it's like now it's the government, is supposed to like take care of us instead of God.
Yeah, there's that for sure. So Sean and Keegan both have their hands up.
Yeah, I think one thing that's like reflecting on this conversation, it's like we have to recognize that there's differences in the way that the society and lifestyle was organized in the time of St. Thomas to how it is today. Like a lot of the things that seem to be missing from like the economic discussion of value of goods is like, okay, people today, the average person is not a subsistence farmer, whereas at that time the average person was a subsistence farmer.
Mhm.
Now today the average person is in some way, shape, or form a merchant. And like the way he's describing this is not the same. Like this is, we're talking about subsistence farmers and how they sell their goods based on how much labor they put into it, and it's not equally applicable there. And then there are other things like now today, okay, back then the extent of healthcare was effectively like give them some wine so that they
And
don't
bleed
feel
them. Don't forget
bad.
to bleed them.
Bleed them, you know, whatever. But healthcare wasn't expensive or technical or effective necessarily. And now, like, okay, with the principle of subsidiarity, back then, healthcare could be done just by the person on the personal level, by a family. But now, with the technology that we have, like the healthcare system, maybe with the principle of subsidiarity, the lowest possible level where it can be efficiently run would be on the national level, which we can see from like this reaction to the coronavirus. Like we don't have a solid societal level response to it that's causing more damage to the good of all people than would happen if maybe we had a more unified response to it. And you know that's controversial, but it's still like we have to look at the differences from the economy and the way that the society ran in the time of St. Thomas, and the technological advances and the socioeconomical advances of the vast majority of people, making it a whole different way that we can even apply any of these principles.
Yes, but the point of that, and that's, I mean, that is what you just said is really important. But the point of it is to make sure that we're clear on the principles, right? That that when we see injustice, that we know, okay, that's injustice. We need to do something to remedy it. And it just, you know, it sort of just.
Yeah, but about the exchange of goods, it's like, okay, back then the goods, like communally, it's much easier to understand the different inputs
Yeah,
that
the
result
value
in
of
that
things.
of
Right.
value. Whereas like now you have to think about, okay, marketing, you have to think about supply chains, you have to think about risk, you have to think about profit margins based on that, and it's much more complex.
Yeah, it's way more complex, but the point is that like how we determine that, it has to be rational rather than just figuring out how much somebody's going to pay for something, um, or creating like people don't necessarily always need to be told what they need, but a lot of times in the market, people are told what they need. So in other words, producers don't make things that people actually want. They make people want things, right? So I mean, I could think of, as I'm sitting here looking at my computer, I'm like, you know, if I were to make my own computer, I would have it do XYZ, right? But since nobody's made it that way, I'll just settle for this. And so, you know, again, that sort of you know, mass production and all of that's gotten a lot of things in people's hands, but I don't know that it's actually put a lot of stuff in people's hands that they actually want. There's a lot of sort of settling for things, right? Whereas like a personalized economy, it was much easier to do that. And now maybe that can't happen, but it can happen on a smaller level, and that's how it would start, right? So it would happen on a smaller level where we begin to really think about, okay, rather than like making something and then trying to convince people they need it, maybe I'll just find out what people really need and I'll make it. Or maybe I'll actually make something, you know, that's individualized, that, you know, that people want. Because that's ultimately, that's that enters into the sort of the personalistic aspects of economics, which is important, where the person actually gets what they want, and they kind of realize like, okay, it was this person that was responsible for giving it to me. And I can't necessarily say how we get from A to B directly, but eventually we're going to get to a point where injustice piles on injustice, and it's going to all crash. And so we need to sort of make concessions where we can now to move back towards economic justice. Does that make sense? Keegan, what was your question?
I was confused about the part with the family. So we mentioned it a little bit. Basically, you're saying if there's two men working, one of them has a family of 4, one of them is single and has no dependents. The one who is supporting a family of 4 should justly be paid enough to support that, whereas the one who has no dependents should be paid less because he has a lower.
You're not necessarily paid less initially. Think of it in terms of, let's just say that they're both at the bottom of the sort of salary ladder, right?
Sure.
You would say that the guy who has no one that's depending on him would get paid less than the other one, assuming that that you're sort of paying towards the minimum of what they need. But once you sort of get into like further along, well, you could say, okay, well, this guy is a cashier, and that's, he gets paid X amount, and that takes care of his family. But that doesn't mean that, cashier B, who's been here for 30 years and, is single, should get paid less. It's just making sure that they have everything that they need to sort of subsist and thrive versus. Gotcha. Okay, does that make sense?
Yeah, and then the second part of that is, say the father of 4's children grow up and they are no longer dependent on him, and so he is no longer financially supporting them. He doesn't need the same amount of money that he needed when they were his dependents. Does that change what he should be getting paid or not?
It could if the company went, like, let's just say that they became less profitable for some reason, and another guy came along who needed more, or that guy suddenly, the guy who only had one now, it's just him. He gets married and he also has 4 kids. You could reasonably say to that person, hey, you're going to need to take a pay cut because we need to pay this other person more, because he's not making the minimum of what he's supposed to be making.
Okay, that makes sense.
Yeah. I mean, again, in practice, I don't know how often that would happen.
Sure.
But if you had to cut people's salaries, the guy who no longer has people depending on him would be the first one you would go after.
Okay. And then can you factor that into costs, like something you're charging for a good? Like not just value that you are adding to something, but like what you need. Can that be factored in, or is that unjust?
No, that would be, I mean, that could be factored into the total cost of things, however you diffuse it across all of your products or whatever. Yeah, your cost, like, you shouldn't ever, like, operating at a loss isn't good for anybody, right?
Yeah.
Then those people are going to have jobs eventually anyway. So, I mean, striving for profit is a good thing. The question always is, like, how much profit is reasonable, and then what do you do with the profits once you have them? Or the question of getting profits is like, that's what businesses aim for, and they should, and that's good, and but what you do with the profits and how much you actually charge are the two sort of moral questions. Not, the moral question isn't about profit. It's like, how much are you taking above and beyond what you should, based on people's either irrational desires or their just absolute need, and then what are you doing with the profits once you have them?
Gotcha.
So Rob, I'm kind of wondering, because I feel like a lot of companies today, they like kind of like the one mistake they could easily fall into is like if they only pursue, I don't know, it's like they pursue just like maximum profit, which is wrong, but then they like in the sense that they don't seem to throttle it at all. But
Mhm.
once they get the money, then they like try to give back to the community and things like that. I don't know, but I guess
Yeah,
to me it seems like ideally they would try to integrate. I don't know. It kind of seems like they do their business and then they like give to like random other charities. It almost seems like this should be more put together. I don't know.
yeah. I think that the Catholic model would be of a business would be something that has profit sharing in it. Um, so in other words, if a company is very profitable, the employees, no matter who they are, because the profits are essentially part of the common good for the society, which is that company, right? And so everyone should have a proportional share in the profits. And so the ideal Catholic model would be one that has either profit sharing or some sort of way in which the workers get sort of part ownership in the company or something. That would be the Catholic model of a company. And that's actually good, right? Because now the people that work there have sort of more skin in the game. And so you've incentivized them in the right way. All right. Let's go through this real quick with money, and then we'll hit usury, and then we'll be done. All right. So Aristotle talks about two types of exchanges. He talks about what's called a natural exchange and an unnatural exchange. Really, pretty profound. What he means, though, is a natural exchange is when someone exchanges one thing for another thing. Okay. Unnatural exchange would be where somebody exchanges one thing for money. Okay. And let's make sure we qualify this correctly, because again, Aristotle talking 2,300 years ago in a society that's very different. Let's make sure we understand how it applies to us today. So he essentially makes and St. Thomas talks about this, two types of exchanges. And the exchanges are, you take commodity A and you exchange it for commodity B. Okay, but in the middle, you could have money as this sort of medium of exchange. So a cobbler sells his pair of shoes and goes and buys a cow that he needs for beef or something. So he took the money and he had an end in mind for that money. And so that would be, even though it involves money, would be a natural exchange. An unnatural exchange would be if that same cobbler sold his pair of shoes just for the money, for the sake of money itself. All right, not for, and he doesn't necessarily have to have the money and go, okay, I need to go buy a cow today, but so I need to sell these shoes so that I can buy that cow. It's when the money becomes an end in itself. So in other words, when someone sells something or makes some sort of exchange, and then his only interest is for money in and of itself. All right, does that distinction make sense? Go ahead, Keegan. What's your question?
Yeah. It makes sense, but, and maybe this falls into a different category, but like something like saving up money to as a safety measure, somebody gets sick or something like that. Is that
That would be a natural exchange. So anytime the money, you look and go, okay, I need money for X. That's a natural exchange, right? And it may not be that X is specifically I need it for for asthma medicine in 2027. It could just be in case there's a medical emergency in the future. So there's always a reasonable amount of sort of like saving for the future is a good thing. Okay. It's when I simply make an exchange just for the sake of having more money, and that's it. Okay, and so the reason why St. Thomas calls this unnatural is because our desire for money is endless. Like for commodities, we can only have a desire for so many, right? Like I need bread, I'm going to trade for bread. I can only get so many loaves of bread before I'm like, I'm good, I have enough. But if I just trade for money in and of itself, it becomes more and more and more like, and you see this, when you have multi-billionaires who essentially just do things just for the sake of just adding more money to their sort of pot of gold.
I don't know. I think seeing people buying toilet paper proves that someone's desire for an object is unlimited.
Yeah. Maybe, but I think anyone in their right mind, I don't know that that's necessarily are operating with people in their right mind, would say, I'm even the greedy guy in the gospel, right? He's like, oh, my barns are full. I'm even gonna build another bar, and I'm full, and I'm good, so I can eat, drink, and be merry. So that's one of the things that St. Thomas is always very wants to sort of warn us against is when we operate on the realm of where money becomes an end in and of itself. That's when greed becomes, like greed avarice is a capital sin, right? For the very reason that our desire for money has no cap on it.
Though I guess like money doesn't necessarily mean bills and coins, right? So money just means that with like, right? Because
Go ahead, finish your thought.
Even so, I was just thinking about the toilet paper thing. Like in this case, it's not just desiring a natural end or want, but it's desiring value, kind of to infinity.
Yeah, I mean, we kind of, I guess we assign that to money. It doesn't necessarily have to be money per se, although that just seems to be for most people, like, that's why St. Paul says, like, the love of money is the root of all evil. Like, the love money is to treat money as an end in and of itself. All right, and so we have to always be on guard of that, right? So what he says is, okay, well, natural exchanges are those in which you have something specific in mind, even if that thing is, okay, in the future, I need a safety net for this. But if you're moving into the realm of, yeah, I've got 3 million, I'm hoping to make 4. You've now moved into greed, right? And he said in unnatural exchanges, that sort of near occasion of sin is much more likely to happen. We're much more likely to move towards wanting more money.
That makes sense. Can you explain this verse? So we talked over spring break. We were talking about this because I thought about it like this sounds like such a like hippie kind of like thing to say because like I don't know, like it is the love of money the root of all evil?
Well, I mean, Scripture says it, so it must be. So what does it mean, right? Essentially, like he's defining what he's saying is, the capital sins are not necessarily like sins you commit, but they're the roots of all your other sins, right? And so what he's saying is that avarice, when you begin to do all things, like money becomes your god, where money becomes an end in itself and you love it, leads to greater and greater sins. And so at the bottom of it may not be the only root of evil, but it's at the root of all the sort of evil that we commit. All right, let's go for this right here. We'll talk about usury and then we'll be done. And we may set a new record for the longest life session ever.
You got to
Okay.
be so thankful Charby's not here because I've had hours and hour long conversation about usury with Charby.
Okay. Well, at least you could tell him to mark it at 6 at an hour and 10 or 2 hours and 10 minutes into it. We talked about usury. Okay. So usury is still a thing. Let's talk about what it is. Okay. So it doesn't mean charging a high rate of interest per se, and it doesn't even mean that there's a problem, that the church has a problem with interest. What it does mean is that the church has a problem with interest in certain situations. Okay, and then we're going to talk about what those situations are. Okay, so in order to understand this, St. Thomas makes a distinction. He talks about 2 types of goods. Okay, he talks about what are called durables, which are things that when you use them, they're not consumed. And I'll give you an example in a second. And then he talks about consumable things, those things that when you use them, they're gone. All right, so you can easily think of an example of a food as a consumable, whereas a lawnmower might be a durable. Okay, and so he's specifically talking about when you borrow something. Okay, so when you borrow something like a lawnmower, right? you don't consume the lawnmower in its use. So when you borrow it, you actually give the same lawnmower back to someone, okay? But you've used it, and you've returned it, but the person can charge for its use, okay? If somebody gives you an egg, lets you borrow an egg, you're going to consume the egg, and so what you'll do is you'll give them back another egg for it, right? So they haven't lost anything, right? In either case, the person can say, okay, well, you put this wear and tear on my lawnmower. It cost me X amount of time and dollars to deliver it to you and pick it up, and you quantify all of that, and so you say, okay, to use this, it costs $2. So you now owe me the lawnmower back plus the $2. For the egg, the person gives the egg, and then 2 days later, the person gives them back another egg. Okay, they are no worse off than they were before they gave the egg. They haven't lost anything by giving the egg, and so you give back an egg. If you were to demand 2 eggs, you would then say, well, that thing that you consumed, you also have to pay me for using it. So not only did you borrow it, but I'm also going to charge you for using it. Okay, sort of understand the difference. A good example would be a tissue and a pen, right? So I ask you, can I borrow a tissue? And I think we all pretty much know that, okay, I'm going to borrow a tissue from you. I am not giving you back the same tissue, okay? And assuming you'd want a tissue back, I gave you a tissue. And if you were to charge me anything else, you'd be charging for its use, okay? So you've now benefited off of that use, okay? That's usury, okay? That's the notion of usury, where you charge someone for the use of something that they took ownership of, okay? So the tissue became mine when I blew my nose in it. And so, whereas the lawnmower or the pen, if you let me borrow a pen, we're pretty much assuming I'm going to give you back the pen after I'm done writing with it. And you may say, well, in using that, you wasted, a little bit of ink. I'm going to charge you 2 cents. You can charge for its use because the pen is now not quite what it was when you returned it. Okay. Everyone understand the distinction between a durable and a consumable? All right. All right. So that notion, that idea then of durables versus consumable, is the basis of the church's sort of teaching against usury. Okay. So usury then is to charge for money lent. Money, when you give someone money, they become owners of it. And in using the money is consumed. Okay. And this is the way St. Thomas would look at it. Okay. The way we look at it is a little bit different, right? The way we look at it is, well, money, we're living in a sort of money economy. Money isn't necessarily consumed in its use the way it was with St. Thomas. It would depend on what type of goods you exchanged it for. Okay. Did you exchange it for a consumable or a durable good? Okay. And we'll talk about why that is important in a minute. So let's just assume that I'm using a credit card, all right, and I'm buying my groceries with it. Okay. And the credit card company charges me interest on the use of that money for a bunch of durable goods that I bought. Okay. Now they can maybe legitimately charge me a few things, right? They could charge me, okay, well, it costs us, X number of dollars, or X percent for you to use the credit card for the convenience and all of those things, and we have to pay the person, the bill collector, whatever. Okay. Those are all legitimate sort of costs. It's anything above and beyond that's not. All right. So think of maybe a mortgage is a better example. All right. So if you get a mortgage, let's say you get $100,000 mortgage, and the mortgage company charges you an origination fee. All right. That's to cover their costs of lending the money. Right. They have to do paperwork, and maybe they have to have a lawyer, whatever it is. All right. That's all legitimate. right? So they can charge a fee for the money. What they can't charge, though, is any interest above and beyond that.
So why can't they charge a time value, like charge for the time value of money? Like it's more valuable for me to have money 2 years ago than it is for me to have it today.
Okay, so why is that assumed that that is the case? Because it could be, you could easily lose less, right? Like money could be worth less in 2 years too.
Well, I think more because, I mean, we using I'm blanking on my economics from 5 years ago, but whatever, I could have done something else with my money, and doing something else with my money would have been more beneficial.
Yeah, can you, if you can prove that? So in other words, maybe it's easier to see on a personal level. So I go to a guy and I say, I need to borrow $1,000, and he's like, well, I was going to give you, I was going to take that $1,000. I do have $1,000, but I was going to take that and give it and invest it in Microsoft stocks. And so you say to him, okay, fine, I'll pay you back in 2 years the $1,000 plus whatever Microsoft yields. Okay, so totally legitimate. So he was going to use the money for something else. That's a legitimate loss, as long as the guy is willing to say, oh, look, Microsoft is now only worth $500, and he only owes him $500 now. So he has to assume, if he's going to do that, he has to assume the risk. Does that make that part a little clearer?
Rob, this sounds like gambling.
In what way is it gambling?
Like the deal
Investment
that
is gambling.
we're going to imitate the stock market. I don't know.
Well, no, because they're saying, I'm going to do this with the money. And you say, okay, well, I'll make up, because again, to keep it just, right? He's like saying, I'm going to take this money, put it in the stock market, and we'll just assume that there's no gambling element to the stock market to not complicate it. There's nothing gambling with that. It's just simply saying, it was to Casey's point about, well, I could have put the money in something else. If you have your eye set on a specific something else, then part of the sort of contract could be, well, this money was going to go as an investment to Microsoft. So then, are you willing to match what I would have gotten with them? Either way.
And I mean, like, investment can't be gambling. Like, if I I get the stock market seems like it because it's technology. Like, if I start a small business with $100,000, and there's an opportunity for me to lose money or make money, and that's not gambling. That's I mean, at least I don't think it is. That would be investment. That's me trying to make something, trying to be successful. The stock market is just saying, I'm trusting another company or someone else to invest smartly and make real things in exchange, have more people get Microsoft Word so they can make better products and do better things and whatnot.
Yes. Yeah. So any and this becomes the difference between, so that's a legitimate loan, and that's a legitimate, like, a cost of the loan, right? Remember, everything has to be equal. But if he were to then say, okay, I'm going to give you this $1,000, and you have to, in 2 years' time, you have to pay me back $1,500 with no basis. He just says, just for you being able to use my money, then that would be usury. Okay. Is everyone clear on that, the distinction?
Rob, would it be considered usury for, I know some banks or something have, like, if you pay them before the time, like if you pay them more money, like at each payment, you can get like penalty fees for doing stuff like that? Like if
Yeah,
you
I
pay
mean,
off,
so in general, like, mortgages are one of the most, like, usurious, I don't even know how to say the word, usurious types of loans there are, because well, for the first reason that you're borrowing money for a house, right? And the bank actually owns the house, so you're paying for sort of the use of the house. And regardless, over the life of that loan, how much your house is worth, you have to pay them back, usually, in most people's cases, more than the house is worth, when you sort of add all of it up. So there's that aspect of it where it's going for a specific good that you're paying to use, and in using it, they're charging you far more than it's worth. So that would be the first thing. The second thing is that banks, especially in the United States, take very little sort of risk in loaning to people because of the fractional reserve, right? They're not actually loaning you money that they have. They're loaning you money that the government says they can loan to you. And so that immediately becomes usury. Like just the very fact that they even make those kinds of loans, they're always you know, sort of guilty of usury. Does that answer your question, Nicole?
I guess.
Okay. Yes, Keegan.
You bring up risk, and it's just interesting to me where that fits in. So, say just bring it back down to a personal level, not on a bank level. I give somebody else a certain amount of money because they need it at this point in time, and I have it. I am incurring a risk that they will not pay it back. And so there are two ways that I can imagine this going down. Either there's some sort of capital, I think that's the right word, that like they are giving me as like a protection
Collateral.
against collateral, against them not paying me back. Or a different way it could be done, and this might be illegitimate, but like is to charge them overall more. Say I do this to a bunch of different people, charge everyone a little bit extra because there's a risk that certain people won't be able to pay me back. Is one of those like wrong? And that's what's going through my mind.
Yeah, so the second would be wrong because it's unjust for me to pay more because somebody else is risky.
That makes sense. The part
The collateral part makes, I mean, the collateral part is the way to take care of that.
Okay.
Right. Is if, you know, if someone is risky to pay you back, you know, you might have collateral of some sort.
And are we just assuming that there's always like something we can offer as collateral, or if there's not, then you shouldn't be getting a loan?
Yeah, and well, you shouldn't, like if someone is really risky, you probably shouldn't be giving them a loan anyway, right? Like if you're like, okay, this guy's not going to pay me back, then, you know, there's nothing wrong with saying, no, I'm not going to give you a loan.
Okay.
Right. Because again, that's the whole thing with the bank and the fractional reserve is like they're really not taking any risk on somebody defaulting because they haven't actually used any of their real money. Okay, so is everybody clear like what the difference in usury is versus interest, at least that there are some legitimate ways in which interest can be charged. I mean, you can, but typically it would not be, you know, a flat rate of interest or something like that.
What about the idea of an agreed upon late fee?
I mean, that's certainly would be closer to legitimate. So in other words, you would say at, you know, after X number of days, I'm going to charge you a little bit more because by then I need the money and now it becomes a hardship on me. And I need to be, you know, because, you know, maybe, you know, in 12 months, I'm going to need that money back because, you know, that's when it's time to, you know, build a new chicken roost or whatever.
You have to substantiate it in some way, but
yes, yeah. So it has to be very like specific as to why it is and all of that. But that certainly there's nothing wrong with that. And so this is where now like the difference between like investment and why interest isn't necessarily wrong, right? Remember we said that that there's nothing wrong with charging for use of durable goods. So take that same $1,000 that I was going to lend my friend, and he says, well, I'm going to take the $1,000 and I'm going to use it to buy a widget maker or put it in a pool of widget makers. And so now it becomes what he's really buying, what he's really doing is exchanging for the widget maker, right? And so now you have a share of his widget making business. And so you can then expect to share some amount of the profit. as long as you understand that you can also assume some share of the risk. And that's the problem with like small business loans, is that if to be legitimate, they have to be based upon whether the company is profitable or not. And then the same thing with like our 401ks or things like that. What you're really doing is investing in some aspect of the company, and then sharing in their profits. And that may come back as a percentage, it may not. But there's nothing wrong with gaining interest in that way, because you become, in a certain respect, a part of that corporation.
To repeat my question from earlier, from a practical sense, so if we're the victim of injustice, so like if usury is being done against us, it's then still fine for us to engage in?
Yeah, I mean, so like, again, using like credit cards, like, should you not use credit cards because of that? And in a certain respect, if you can avoid it, yes, but you haven't necessarily done anything wrong per se, because you're the sort of victim in this. And if it's coming from a place of need, because it's always, the person who's on the other end of the injustice isn't necessarily doing anything wrong. And credit card companies have set it up now that that you're actually worse off if you don't use a credit card, because the price of everything is 3% more because of them. And so you end up paying, if you pay in cash, you've paid 3% more than you would have if they had factored in the price of cash. And this is why you see some places, smaller businesses will say, the price of the thing is like 3% less than if you pay cash. I think when we were in Europe, there's a lot of smaller companies, like stores, that do that, where they talk about, they'll take less money from you for cash because it actually costs them less.
I think you can do that with like when you're buying a car. Is that like a more expensive item?
Yes.
And ask them like at the end when you're getting ready to shake, like, hey, can you cut it 3% if I pay for the
Yes.
tractor?
Yep. Yeah. So back to Casey's question, it becomes really difficult not to play the game, right? Like it's sort of set up that it's a prisoner's dilemma, and you're actually, everyone's worse off, but you're worse off if you don't do it. And so you end up paying it, because at least you can still have your money until the end of the month, and maybe gain some of that 3% extra you paid in the price before you pay off the monthly bill of the credit card.
And that's not to mention the fact that you need a credit score for so many things, especially like houses and cars.
Yes.
And loans.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I think I'm kind of confused on the mortgage thing. So were you saying that like all mortgages were usury, or like it's just if they kind of like set it up where the rate's too high, or
no, I would say in every case, it's funny, some of the bigger banks, Islam, they have Islamic laws, or they have a lot of laws against usury, and their definition is slightly different. But a lot of banks, because they want Islamic business, will change the way they give mortgages and loans to Muslims, which is actually kind of interesting. But in the case of a mortgage, almost all of them are usury, regardless of the interest rate, because it doesn't cost the bank anything short of whatever it costs the person, to do the paperwork and maybe check your credit or whatever. It doesn't cost them anything beyond that, because the money they're using is sort of just created out of thin air. The government just says, okay, if you have 10% if you actually have 10% of the money, you can make loans, for the other 90%. So they just sort of create money out of nothing. So they don't actually lose. If you default, they don't lose any money. They haven't lost it.
I heard, what I heard was that normally there's private investors that are behind the mortgages. And so they're actually it's an investment for, like, you could actually invest in, to the point that the person paying back the bank for the house is really paying back you as the investor. You're taking that risk that they're going to pay back or whatever. But
Yeah,
then
sometimes.
I heard that now that pipeline's dried up because of the coronavirus, now the government's going to start buying them. So maybe that's like what you were talking about, where all of a sudden the infinite pool of money that's not real is like going to somehow back these things. I don't know.
Yeah, well, and usually that sort of buying of later on, it always happens later on when they've already collected most of the interest up front, and they know, okay, this person is like zero risk to default at this point. So I mean, I can remember like when our mortgage, like when we were, I don't know, maybe 14 or 15 years in, they sold it to somebody else because we had, you'd pay your interest up front, and I was mostly just paying it down, and that was it. And so the yield on it was, from their perspective, was pretty low. And there was very little risk at this point of me defaulting or anything like that. So they'll often sell them off to somebody else. So I think that's what you're talking about. But so they essentially make money out of nothing, which is again very obviously very unjust.
Yeah.
If they actually had to take money out of the bank that people had loaned them, or the people had deposited there, at the very least, the people would see a higher percentage, of interest rate on their money coming in from all these mortgages, right? Which is not what they see at all.
So what are like alternatives? I mean, it kind of seems like,
Getting a mortgage?
yeah, it kind of seems like you almost have to. I don't know.
Yeah, you don't really. I mean, unless you're one of the few people who is able to save up and pay cash for a home. Again, it's one of those prisoner's dilemmas.
Yeah.
But what we have to sort of recognize again is that eventually what's holding that up will collapse, because when it's sort of sitting on an economic injustice, it will eventually collapse. And so we have to kind of be prepared for that and understand it, that it's there. All right, any other questions? I think I've sort of exhausted you guys. This went way longer than I thought we were going to go.
Just a little.
Back freshman year, I'm pretty sure all life classes were like 2.5 hours.
Yeah, and when we didn't have when we didn't have the when we didn't have someone coming into the room after us, for sure, I guess. But this was a marathon life.
I think it's really important that we started with the just value of things, because I think it really is important in the user discussion, because from my previous experience of the conversation, like I always kind of went the direction of saying like, well, if someone else can give me this for my money, then I had like there's this value to the money that exists, but there's actually like a just value for things that really, to me, changed the way I thought about it.
Yeah, me too. Honestly, that's sort of where I realized everything started making sense to me when I was able to connect the dots to a sort of that there has to be an objective value of something, even if we sort of struggle to find the exact amount, that it still has to be there.
This is kind of making me think we should, it's kind of like, the Pope has to care for a lot of people, but a lot of people pray for him. Like we should pray for our like bosses and stuff too. Because I'm just like thinking about all the responsibility after this discussion that you have, like the higher up you go in a company. Like,
no, I mean, that's definitely
Yeah.
true, and not something I necessarily thought about initially, but yeah, I definitely think that is the case. And it just makes you again realize like how like connected we really are, right? Like, and how connected we're supposed to be, and what the vision of humanity is so different from where we're at now.
So
Because that's such a personal approach.
would it be bad to work for a bank or like a mortgage broker of sorts? Like, how do you?
Yeah, I think I would personally I would steer clear of that. I don't know that I'd want to have a conversation with someone about that, but
Say, what about something like a credit union, who tend to be less exploitive?
yeah. So you moving towards, again, remember we talked about sort of like moving towards something more just as an alternative, because obviously we're not going to get up tomorrow morning and go, okay, banks are done.
Right.
but we can move towards things that are more just, and certainly a credit union is more just than your typical like bank. You know, still having issues, and it's not necessarily, you know, interestingly enough, though, I mean, the last time I checked, the Vatican Bank like upholds to all the Catholic principles. So such a thing, you know, actually can exist. And
So, say, am I able to get a mortgage through the Vatican Bank
I don't know. I don't know if they do mortgages. That's a good question.
or just a loan? Like,
Yeah. Well, I
what's
mean,
the
I'm sure they do.
qualifications?
I'm sure they
You have to
do
be
loans,
priest or-
but
It
yeah,
seems-
I don't know any of that, but I'm sure. I mean, I know they do loans. I don't know that they.
It seems like a better solution would be like, I don't know, like person to person, like a close friend. I'm like, you know, you're kind of old. I don't know. You have a lot of money. Could I do a mortgage from you? I don't know. I don't know.
Yeah, well, it's the George Bailey effect, right? Like that again is like another one of those. Well, I mean, when you watch Frank Capra movies, you sort of there's a lot of Catholicism smuggled into it, and that scene, right, where you know, all the people are like 100% invested in each other, right? And the part where they make the run on the bank, he's like, hold on, how much do you actually need for right now? And I mean, that's how it should actually look, right? And that's the sort of the why I'm blanking on the protagonist's name, but like he's
You mean
the
George Bailey?
no the I mean the bad
Oh, you
guy's
mean
name.
Mr. Potter?
Yeah, Mr. Potter. Yes, like he's
The
like
Christmas
Good
movie,
job,
Brett.
Andrew.
the,
Slamming
oh,
that trivia.
if
Casey, if
anyone
there's
was
one
going to
thing I
answer
know,
it, it
it's
was Andrew.
movies.
Yeah, it was Andrew. That was a softball. I tossed it out there for him. Yeah, so like the Mr. Potters of the world are, you know, have sort of won out against the George Baileys. And like next time you watch It's a Wonderful Life, like sort of look at how that's designed, and it's very Catholic in its sort of understanding.
What about
Yeah, it's-
our Lord's
which one-
command or his oh, you can go ahead, Andrew.
I was gonna say on that, it's funny when you